The parking space was nothing special. It was a simple, concrete rectangle. Faded white numbers painted years ago, slightly cracked from heat and time. Still, it mattered. In a neighborhood run by an HOA, small things always mattered more than they should. I had lived in the community for 3 years by then, long enough to know the rules, long enough to know the unspoken hierarchy, and long enough to keep my head down. I paid my dues on time. I trimmed my lawn within the allowed height. I followed the parking rules exactly. 1 car, 1 assigned spot, no guests overnight without notice. I was the kind of resident HOAs loved, quiet, compliant, and visible. My assigned spot sat close to my unit. That was part of why I bought the place. Easy access. No long walks at night, no hassle. The deed, the HOA map, and every document I had all showed the same number next to my name. That spot was mine, until one morning it was not. I came home, late from work, and found a different car sitting there. Large SUV, polished and spotless, parked perfectly between the lines like it had always belonged there. At first I assumed it was a mistake, maybe a guest. Maybe someone confused the numbers. That happens sometimes. So I parked in a visitor spot and went inside. The next day the car was still there. This time there was a small laminated sign on the windshield facing outward. It read reserved, do not park, HOA authorized. That was the first red flag. I checked my mailbox and found a printed notice. No name, no signature, just an HOA letterhead and a warning about unauthorized parking. According to the paper, I had parked in a space not assigned to me, and future violations would result in towing and fines. It felt unreal. I read it twice. Then a third time I went inside and pulled out my HOA documents. The map was clear. The number was clear. Space was mine. I sent an email to the HOA management company with a photo of the notice and my documents attached. I expected a simple correction, quick apology. Maybe a form email saying there was an error. What I got instead was silence. For 3 days, the SUV stayed parked in my spot. For 3 days, I used visitor parking and worried about getting cited myself. On the 4th day, another notice appeared on my door. This one was sterner. It referenced repeated violations and mentioned fines. That was when I realized this was not a mistake. Someone was doing this on purpose. I started paying closer attention. The SUV belonged to a woman who lived 2 buildings over. I had seen her. Before, everyone had. She walked the neighborhood like she owned it, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for rule breakers. She was always talking at people, never with them. She wore that tight smile that never reached her eyes. She was on the HOA board. Her name came up often in emails and notices. She signed off on warnings. She chaired meetings. She enforced rules with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. People whispered about her, but no one challenged her. Challenging the HOA meant fines, letters, and stress most people did not want. Now, she had decided my parking spot was hers. I tried again to contact management. This time I included more documents, including the page from my closing paperwork. That listed the assigned spot. I stayed polite, calm. Professional, the response came the next day. It was short and dismissive. According to their records, the spot was reassigned temporarily due to community needs. Further discussion should be directed to the board. No explanation, no timeline, no proof. I knew that was not how assignments worked. Parking spots were deeded. They were not casually reassigned, especially not without notice or consent. The power imbalance hit me all at once. She was not just a neighbor. She was a board member. She had access to records, enforcement tools, and influence. I was just another resident. Still, I was not ready. To give up, I requested a hearing. Weeks passed. During that time, the pressure increased. I received notices about minor issues I had never been cited for before. A trash bin left out too long. A plant pot considered unapproved. A warning about noise that made no sense. Each notice felt like a message. Fall in line. The parking situation became a daily stress. Every evening, I circled for visitor spots. Every morning, I walked past my own space occupied by her SUV. She never acknowledged it, not once. At the hearing, the board reviewed the issue, or at least pretended to. One submitted documents, explained calmly. I pointed out the rules. The decision came quickly. They sided with her. The explanation was vague and filled with technical language that meant nothing. Temporary adjustment, board discretion, community harmony. I walked out of that meeting feeling small and angry. For the first time since moving in, I considered selling. Not because of the spot, but because of what it represented. If they could take that, they could take anything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and reread every HOA document I owned. The bylaws, the covenants, the election rules, the enforcement procedures. That was when something changed, buried deep. In the paperwork was a section about board conduct, conflicts of interest, abuse of authority, ethical standards. Most residents never read that far. Most never needed to. I did. I started noticing patterns. Complaints tied to certain residents. Fines that seemed selective. Enforcement that focused on people who pushed back, and one name appeared again and again. The woman with the SUV, the board member who took my spot. I realized something important in that moment. The HOA only had power because people believed it was untouchable. But the rules applied to the board too, at least on paper. I did not know it yet, but that parking space had just dragged me into a fight I could not unsee. And once I saw how the system worked, I could not go back to pretending. Everything was fine. Once you realize something is wrong, you start seeing it everywhere. After the hearing, I stopped trusting anything the HOA sent me. Every notice, every email, every posted rule suddenly felt less like guidance and more like a weapon. I did not respond right away. I watched. I read. The first thing I learned was that the HOA depended on people staying tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of reading long documents. Tired of feeling like the troublemaker. The system was built to wear residents down slowly, not all at once. A notice here. A warning there. Nothing big enough to justify a lawyer. It's just enough. To make life uncomfortable, my parking spot was only the beginning. I started keeping records, not just of my own issues, but of everything. Emails from the board, community-wide announcements, meeting minutes posted weeks late. I created folders and timelines. I wrote dates and times in a notebook. At first it felt paranoid, then it felt necessary. I noticed how often rules were enforced unevenly. One neighbor left trash bins out for days and never got a notice. Another received a fine for the same thing after 1 hour. Lawn violations appeared only on certain streets. Noise complaints targeted specific units, and always the same board member was involved. She chaired enforcement meetings. She signed warning letters. She responded sharply to residents who questioned anything. People avoided her. Some whispered about moving because of her. Others just learned to stay quiet. I also learned that many residents had no idea what the bylaws actually said. They relied on summaries, emails, and word of mouth. The board knew this. They counted on it. One evening, I knocked on a neighbor's door, then another. I kept it casual. I asked if they had ever had issues with parking fines or warnings that felt unfair. At first, people hesitated. Then stories poured out. A couple had been fined for a grill that was allowed under the rules. A single mother had been warned about her kids playing chalk games on the sidewalk. An older man had his car towed after a board member claimed it was abandoned, even though it was registered and driven daily. The pattern was clear. People who questioned rules became targets. I started attending HOA meetings regularly. I sat quietly in the back. I listened more than I spoke. The meetings were short and controlled. Questions were discouraged. Discussions were shut down quickly. Decisions were often made before residents arrived. The board voted as a block. No debate. No explanation. Still, there were cracks. During one meeting, a resident asked about parking assignments. The response was vague and rushed. Another asked about fines collected over the past year. The treasurer stumbled through an answer that did not match the published budget, I saw fear in the board members who were not her. Fear of conflict. Fear of being singled out next. That was when I started reading the election rules. The HOA. Bylaws allowed any homeowner in good standing to run. For the board, elections were annual. Most seats went uncontested. People assumed it was pointless to run. The same names rotated year after year, but the rules were clear. Campaigning was allowed. Access to records was allowed once elected. Oversight was allowed, and removal of board members was possible. I did not decide to run that night. Not yet. The idea felt huge, risky. I was not a confrontational person. I had a job, a life, stress already. But the parking spot was still gone. Fines kept coming. And the more I learned, the harder it became to ignore. One afternoon, I found a notice on my door about parking again. This time it claimed I had parked overnight in a restricted area. I had not even been home that night. I responded with proof, receipts, timestamps, photos. The response came back cold and dismissive. The fine stood. That was the moment something snapped. I realized I was already paying the price of resistance, even while trying to stay polite. The system was not neutral. It rewarded silence and punished anyone who spoke up. So I stopped playing defense. I sent formal requests for records, meeting minutes, enforcement logs. Fine histories by law, the HOA had to provide them. Delayed. They pushed back, sent partial information, but every delay left a paper trail. Other residents noticed. They started asking me questions. Quiet ones. In hallways. By mailboxes. They wanted to know what I was doing and if it was safe. I told them the truth. That the rules mattered. That the board was not above them. Fear was the real tool being used. Some listened. Some walked away. Then something unexpected happened. I received an anonymous envelope under my door. Inside were copies of emails, internal board communications, messages that were never meant for residents to see. They showed favoritism, personal grudges, jokes about fines, comments about how certain people needed to be taught lessons, and at the center of many of them was the same woman. The parking spot was mentioned directly. She referred to it as a temporary inconvenience to remind someone of boundaries. My boundaries. I sat there reading those pages with shaking hands. It was one thing to suspect abuse of power. It was another to see it written so casually. I did not know who sent the envelope. I still do not. But I understood why they did it. They were afraid. They were tired. That night I made my decision. If I stayed quiet, nothing would change. If I moved, someone else would take my place. The system would keep running the same way. But if I ran for the board, even if I lost, I could force questions into the open. I could make people look at what they had accepted as normal. The parking spot was never about convenience. It was about control. And I was done letting someone else decide how much space I was allowed to take. The next chapter would not be quiet. Once I decided to run, everything moved faster. Fear has a way of slowing you down when you let it. Action does the opposite. The moment I filled out the candidate form, it felt like stepping into traffic without knowing who would stop. There was no applause, no encouragement from the board. Just a short confirmation email and silence. Word spread anyway. In HOA communities, nothing stays quiet for long. Neighbors started looking at me differently. Some smiled in a way that felt hopeful. Others avoided eye contact. A few pulled me aside to warn me gently that going against the board never ended well. I listened. I thanked them. I kept going. Campaigning in an HOA is strange. There are no rallies, no speeches, no debates, just flyers, short bios, and conversations by mailboxes. The rules were strict about what could be said and where. I followed them exactly. No attacks, no accusations, just facts. I wrote about transparency, about fair enforcement, about residents having a voice. I did not mention names. I did not mention my parking spot. Anyone who had lived there long enough already knew who I meant. The response surprised me. People reached out quietly. Late-night messages notes slipped under my door. Stories poured in. Fines that made no sense. Warnings issued without proof. Requests ignored until it was too late to appeal. Many of them had tried to fight back once. Most never tried again. Collected everything. I did not promise revenge. I did not promise miracles. I promised to listen and follow the rules as written. The board noticed suddenly. I received more notices than ever. My window blinds were the wrong shade. My welcome mat was unapproved. The package left at my door was considered clutter. Each violation came with a deadline and the threat of fines. I responded to every one with photos, dates, and citations from thebylaws.com. Precise, unemotional. That seemed to make it worse. The woman who took my parking spot started appearing more often near my unit, standing just long enough to be noticed, writing things down, smiling without warmth. She never spoke to me. She did not need to. The message was clear. I was being watched. Then came the rumor campaign. Someone told me she was saying I wanted to dismantle the HOA, that I was reckless, that I would raise dues and invite chaos. None of it was true, but fear does not care about truth. It cares about uncertainty. So I adjusted. I asked for permission to host a small meet and greet in a common area. I followed the process, unsubmitted. The request early. It was denied without explanation. Instead, I knocked on doors. Not everyone answered. Some closed the door politely. Some invited me in and talked for an hour. I listened more than I spoke. That mattered. People were tired of being talked at. One older resident told me. She had stopped opening HOA emails because they made her anxious. A younger couple said they planned to move because they felt targeted. A renter admitted he had never voted because he thought it was pointless. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. The HOA was not just poorly managed, it was captured by a small group who had learned how to turn rules into leverage. Election day came quietly. No signs, no announcements beyond a notice buried in a newsletter. Ballots were mailed. Most people barely noticed. I waited. The night before results were announced, I barely slept. Not because I expected to win, but because I knew something would change either way. You do not poke a system like that without consequences. The email arrived the next afternoon. I had won a seat, not by a landslide, not by a fluke, by a clear margin. I read it twice, then sat back and stared at the wall. A mix of relief and dread washed over me. Winning was only the beginning. Now I would have access. And that access came with responsibility. The first board meeting after the election was tense. I walked into the room and felt the shift immediately. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed me. Some board members smiled stiffly. Others looked uncomfortable. She did not smile at all. The meeting followed. The usual script. Approval of minutes, budget updates, routine votes. Then it came time for new business. I asked questions. Simple ones. About enforcement consistency. About parking reassignment authority. About how conflicts of interest were handled. The answers were vague, defensive, rushed. I asked for documentation. The room grew quiet. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked for records that the bylaws said board members were entitled to review. They agreed reluctantly. Over the next weeks, I received access to internal files, enforcement logs, email chains, fine histories. And with each document, the picture grew clearer and uglier. Certain residents were flagged repeatedly with notes that went beyond rule enforcement. Personal comments, frustrations, desires to make. Examples: parking reassignment used as leverage. Fines increased after complaints. And there it was. My name. My unit. My spot. The reassignment had never been approved by the full board. It was initiated by her. Quietly justified after the fact. Framed as temporary, but never scheduled to end. I documented everything. I cross-checked timelines. I compared enforcement patterns, found discrepancies between what residents were told and what the board discussed privately. This was not just Abuse of power. This was misconduct. I brought my concerns to the board privately first. That was the proper step. I laid out the facts. I showed the records. I asked for an explanation. The response was cold. They accused me of misinterpreting documents, of stirring trouble, of breaking trust. One member suggested I drop it for the good of the community. That was the moment. I understood something important. They were not afraid of being wrong, or they were afraid of being exposed, and she was afraid of losing control. The next move would not be mine alone. I would need the residents, same ones who had been fined, warned, and silenced. I did not know yet how far this would go, but I knew one thing for sure. The parking spot had opened a door she could not close again. And on the other side of that door was everything she worked so hard to hide. Once you were inside the system, you start seeing how carefully it is stitched together. From the outside, the HOA looked rigid and official. From the inside, it looked fragile. Rules were applied based on mood. Decisions were shaped by whoever spoke the loudest. And fear did most of the heavy lifting. I did not rush. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I started pulling one thread at a time. My first move was procedural. I requested a formal audit of enforcement actions over the past 2 years. The bylaws allowed it with a simple board vote. The request alone caused visible tension. No one wanted to vote against transparency in writing, but no one wanted to open those files either. The vote passed. Barely the audit revealed what I already suspected. A small group of residents accounted for a large share of fines. Many violations were minor or subjective. Some had no photos attached. Others were issued without prior warnings. Despite rules requiring them, patterns emerged. I prepared a summary. Clean, factual, no names at first. Just data. When I presented it at the next board meeting, the room felt heavier. Board members shifted in their seats. One asked if this was really necessary. Another suggested focusing on future improvements instead of past issues. She stayed. Quiet. That worried me more than anger would have. After the meeting, residents started reaching out again. This time, they were less afraid. They had seen the agenda. They had seen that questions were being asked from inside the board, not just from the outside. I told them the truth, that the system only changed if people were willing to be visible. That silence protected the wrong people. Some agreed to submit formal complaints. Others allowed me to review their cases. Each story added weight. Then I found the conflict of interest file. It was buried deep, disclosure form that board members were supposed to update annually. Most had done it casually. One had not updated hers in years. Her form listed a different parking assignment than the one she was using, one closer to her unit. The same one she had taken from me, she had reassigned it to herself. No vote, no notice, no disclosure. I checked the dates. The reassignment happened shortly after a resident had challenged her on a different issue. She had lost that argument. Days later, the parking map was quietly changed. It was not just about convenience. It was retaliation. I brought this to the board. This time I did not soften it. I laid out the timeline, the rules, the missing approval, the undisclosed benefit. The reaction was immediate. She denied everything. Said the reassignment was temporary. Claimed management handled it. Accused me of targeting her personally. Other board members looked stunned. They had trusted her, or at least relied on her to handle enforcement. Now they were seeing the cost of that trust. The meeting ended without a resolution, but something had shifted. Within days, I received an official warning from the board. It accused me of harassment and misuse of board access. The timing was obvious, the intent even more so. I responded in writing, calm, documented, cited the bylaws, requested clarification on which rule I had violated. No response. Instead, residents began receiving emails defending the board's integrity and warning against misinformation. The language was careful but pointed, did not name me, but everyone knew. I knew what they were trying to do. Frame me as the problem. Isolate me. Make this about personalities instead of facts, so I changed the frame. I requested a special open meeting to discuss enforcement transparency and board ethics. The bylaws required it if enough residents signed on. I gathered signatures. It was easier than I expected. People were ready. The night of the meeting, the room was full. Not just the usual handful of residents, but dozens. Standing room only. The board looked unprepared. I presented the findings. The audit. The parking reassignment. The conflict of interest. This time, I named names. I had two. Gasps rippled through the room. People whispered. Phones came out. Notes were taken. She tried to interrupt. The chair shut it down. For once, the rules worked in favor of order. Residents spoke next. It's onebyone.com. Emotional. Direct. They talked about fines, about fear, about being targeted, about feeling powerless. The pattern was undeniable. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved. Officially. But the damage was done. The story was out. The board could not unsee it. Neither could the community. The next morning, my parking spot was empty. No notice. No explanation. Just an open space waiting for my car. It should have felt like victory. Oh. Instead, it felt like confirmation. She was retreating. And people like her never did that without planning their next move. Within a week, she filed a formal complaint against me, accusing me of misconduct and calling for my removal from the board. The irony was almost impressive. The bylaws required an investigation. This time, it's time. Everything would be on record. The fight had moved from quiet control to open conflict, and there was no going back. The next chapter would decide who really ran this neighborhood. The complaint landed exactly how I expected it to. Formal, polite, carefully worded. Accused me of creating a hostile environment, abusing my position as a board member, and spreading misinformation that harmed the community. It painted me as unstable and reckless, someone who could not be trusted with responsibility. What it did not include was evidence that omission mattered more than anything else. The bylaws were clear. A removal request triggered an internal review. Documentation had to be examined. Claims had to be supported. The accused had the right to respond in writing and in person. For the first time since this began, the process worked in my favor. I submitted my response. Every sentence was backed by a document. Every claim tied to a date, a rule, or a record. I did not insult her. I did not question her motives. Focused on actions and outcomes. That contrast spoke louder than anything I could have said. The review. Committee was made up of board members and a representative from the management company. People who had spent years avoiding conflict now had no choice but to sit with it as the review moved forward. Something unexpected happened. The pressure shifted. Other board members started reaching out privately. Not in support exactly, but in discomfort. They asked questions they should have asked years ago. They admitted they had never looked closely at enforcement records. They said they trusted her because she was confident and willing to do the unpleasant work. They were starting to realize the cost of that. Convenience. She reacted by tightening her grip. Emails went out more frequently. Notices became harsher. Language grew sharper. She framed everything as an attack on order and values. She warned of chaos if discipline weakened. But people were no longer listening the same way. Residents compared notes. They talked openly now. They realized their experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern. Someone leaked more internal emails. This time, they circulated fast. In them, she complained about residents by name. She mocked people for not understanding rules. She herself bent. She bragged about making examples out of troublemakers. There was no context that made it look better. The management company panicked. They issued statements distancing themselves. They reminded the board of compliance obligations. They asked for guidance they should have enforced years earlier. The investigation hearings were scheduled. The first one focused on me. I sat in a plain room under harsh lighting and answered questions calmly. I explained why I requested records, why I raised concerns internally before going public, why the parking reassignment mattered as evidence of a larger issue. I stuck to facts. When it was her turn, the tone changed. She was defensive, sharp, dismissive. She contradicted herself. She blamed management, then residents, and other board members. She framed herself as a victim of ingratitude. At one point, she admitted she reassigned the parking spot without a vote because she felt it was within her discretion. That admission landed heavily. The committee paused the session. The next hearing focused on her conduct. Residents were invited to submit statements. Many did. More than anyone expected, stories poured in. Not emotional rants, but timelines and receipts. Photos of notices, emails with no responses, fines issued without warnings, appeals ignored. The pattern was impossible to dismiss. Still, removal from an HOA board is not easy. It requires votes, procedures, and patience. She knew that. She leaned on it. She threatened legal action. She accused the board of betrayal, but the board had changed. Fear no longer unified them. Exposure did. When the vote finally came, it was not dramatic. No shouting, no speeches. Just raised hands and recorded decisions. She was removed from her position. The room felt quiet afterward, not relieved, just still. Her removal triggered a cascade. Policies were reviewed, fines were refunded, enforcement paused while procedures were rewritten. The parking map was corrected officially and distributed to all residents for the first time in years. People felt like the rules meant what they said. I got my parking spot back weeks earlier. Now it was on paper, signed, recorded, transparent. She did not disappear quietly. She sent emails accusing everyone of betrayal. She filed complaints that went nowhere. She threatened lawsuits that never materialized. Each message grew less composed. Eventually, the emails stopped. I saw her once after that, packing boxes into the same SUV that started everything. She did not look at me. She did not need to. Her power was gone. The neighborhood felt different in small ways. People smiled more. They talked longer by mailboxes. Meetings ran slower, but felt real. Questions were answered. Votes were explained. It was not perfect. Never would be, but it was honest. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired and proud in a quiet way. Not because I won, but because I did not back down. The parking spot was just concrete, just paint. But it had revealed something rotten beneath the surface. And once exposed, it could not be covered up again. Still, one chapter remained. Removing her was not the same as fixing everything she broke. The final chapter would be about what comes after control is stripped away, about what happens when a community has to learn how to govern itself again. Power does not vanish when you remove the person holding it. It lingers in habits, in silence, in the way people wait for permission even when none is needed anymore. After her removal, the HOA entered an unfamiliar phase. There was no villain to point at, no single voice dominating meetings. That should have felt freeing. Instead, it felt awkward. People were unsure how much they were allowed to speak. Board members hesitated before enforcing even clear rules, afraid of repeating. The past, the damage she left behind was not just procedural. It was cultural. My role on the board shifted overnight. I was no longer the dissenter or the problem. It became a reference point. People asked me how things worked. They asked what the rules actually said. They asked if they were allowed to question. Notices without punishment. I answered honestly. I pointed to the bylaws, reminded them that the HOA was not a separate force. It was a tool the community controlled, or failed to. The board began rebuilding slowly. We revised enforcement policies first. Clear steps, written warnings, documented evidence, appeal processes that actually paused fines. It was tedious work, unexciting, necessary. Next came transparency. Meeting minutes were posted on time. Budgets were broken down in plain language. Votes were recorded with names attached. No more vague summaries that hid accountability. Some board members struggled with the change. They had enjoyed the cover. of ambiguity. Others grew into it, surprised by how much easier decisions became when nothing was hidden. Residents noticed. Meetings filled up again, but this time with curiosity instead of anger. People asked questions without shaking hands or lowered voices. Disagreements happened, but they stayed focused on issues. It's not intimidation. The parking situation became symbolic. We reviewed every assignment, cross-checked deeds, corrected errors. That had existed for years. Residents who had quietly accepted worse spots learned they had rights. Adjustments were made fairly and openly. When my turn came, I parked in my restored spot and sat in the car for a moment before going inside, not out of triumph, but reflection. That space had cost me sleep, time, and peace. It had also given me clarity. I thought about how easily I could have accepted the first notice and moved on. How many people had done exactly that before me? Much harm can hide behind polite language and laminated signs. The woman who started this story faded. From daily conversation, her name stopped coming up. That was the final loss of power. When fear no longer keeps someone present, I did not seek another term on the board after mine ended. By then, others were stepping forward. Residents who once stayed silent now volunteered. Committees formed. Responsibility spread out instead of piling onto one person. That was the real win. I still live in the community, still follow the rules, but I no longer see them as weapons or traps. They are agreements now, shaped by people who understand. What happens when they are abused? Sometimes new residents ask about the parking map, about old stories they have heard. I keep it simple. I tell them to read the bylaws, to ask questions, to never assume authority is untouchable, because control only works when people believe it is permanent. The parking spot never changed. It was always just concrete. What changed was who was allowed to decide who belonged there, and in the end, that decision came back to the community where it always should have been. The space was never stolen. It was reclaimed.